In this talk, I will try to develop an ecological explanation of color categorization, which might also be useful for other kinds of perceptual categorization. Color categorization has been a prime example to investigate the relationship between perception and cognition, and more specifically between perception and language. This is the case because there's an obvious difference between the way we perceive colors and the way we communicate about color. We are able to perceive millions of different colors along three perceptual dimensions: hue, lightness, and saturation. For example, the colors in the background here are ordered vertically according to their lightness, and horizontally according to their hue, which is their greenish-ness, bluishness, reddish-ness, and yellowishness. Saturation defines the amount of color or colorfulness of a particular color shade. However, we do not refer to metric evaluations of hue, saturation, and lightness when we communicate about colors. Instead, we use color terms that refer to more or less discrete color categories, such as these: green, blue, purple, etc. These color categories collapse the three dimensions of color perception, hue, saturation, and lightness, and treat color as if there was a clear-cut distinction, for example, between red and orange. It is not clear where color categories come from and how color categories are related to color perception. Originally, there were two main hypotheses about the origin of color categories. Universalism predicted that color categories are universal in the sense that they do not depend on language and culture. And in contrast, linguistic relativism predicted that color categories depend on language and culture, following the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The universalist reasoning was that categorization is the result of the way we perceive colors, and the role of language is merely to map labels in those perceptually defined categories. In contrast, the relativist reasoning was that it is the labeling that distinguishes the different categories, and this language-based categorization may affect the way we perceive and understand the world around us. Since universalism assumes biologically inherited perceptual mechanisms, the perceptual determination of color categories implies that all human beings have the same categories, independent of languages. In contrast, relativists predicted variation of color categorization because linguistic conventions vary with language and culture. There were four major approaches to test these two competing hypotheses. Let's start with color-opponency. Opponency is a fundamental principle of color perception. We know the cone-opponent mechanisms so precisely that we can model them as shown by the diagram here. However, color categories do not align with cone-opponent mechanisms. This is also true if we focus only on the so-called herring colors, red, yellow, green, and blue, shown on the right here. So cone-opponent mechanisms cannot explain color categorization. Categorical perception is the second classical idea for linking perception and categorization. Often the rainbow has been used as the prime example for categorical perception. It has been assumed that the wavelengths of the light vary continuously, but that we distinguish 7 rainbow stripes categorically. This example is problematic because the rainbow is a very special, complicated phenomenon, and it has stripes for reasons unrelated to color categorization. When investigating categorical perception scientifically, it is crucial how continuous color perception is sampled. According to the idea of categorical perception, color differences should be perceived as larger when the colors belong to two different categories than when they belong to the same. For example, two colors on either side of the blue-purple category here should appear to be more different or less similar than two comparable colors within purple. Hence, there should be a category-specific effect, or shortly category effect, on how we distinguish colors. There are no consistent category effects on discrimination thresholds. In contrast, there are category effects on accuracy and response times in speeded discrimination tasks, and these are probably due to attention. And there are also rather robust category effects on short-term memory. These observations mean that our fundamental ability to see colors is not related to color categories, but that there may be effects of color categorization at a higher, more cognitive level of processing. There has been a mock experiment in a BBC documentary. It claimed that the Himba in Tanzania would have difficulties to see certain color differences because they lack respective color words. This idea contradicts scientific evidence. Let's move to the third idea about the perceptual salience of focal colors. Perceptual salience basically means that certain colors jump out to the eye. To illustrate that, I tried to produce that effect by making the typical red, yellow, green, and blue much more saturated and colorful than the other tiles. Such peaks of saturation for prototypes exist in Munsell color chips. Munsell color chips are the stimulus set used in almost all classical studies on color categories. As a result, the typical red, yellow, green, and blue are protruding when representing the stimulus set in a three-dimensional color space. This has led some authors to claim that the prototypes of red, yellow, green, and blue are so-called focal colors due to their perceptual salience. However, this is a property of the stimulus set, not of human color perception. There exist intermediate colors that are more saturated than those category prototypes. The fourth approach looked at variation across languages. Remember that categories are expected to vary across languages according to linguistic relativism, but to be stable according to universalism. There are clear differences across languages, especially when comparing our color categories with those of non-industrialized languages. However, there are also statistical regularities across fundamentally different languages. In sum, there is some evidence for regularities across languages, which is in line with universalist predictions. However, there is no convincing evidence for perceptual determinants. So it is an open question where those regularities come from. On the other hand, we saw some variation of color categories across languages, but this variation is not completely open to any kind of linguistic convention. There's also some evidence for category effects, but these are very small and sensitive to task settings. Also, these category effects do not affect fundamental perceptual abilities, but work at a rather cognitive level, for example, on attention or memory. So a clear-cut dichotomy between universalist and relativist explanations seems not to be helpful. Based on some recent studies, I would like to argue for three alternative approaches. First, that categorization is neither bound to perception nor to naming. We developed a new task to disentangle categorization and naming. In the categorization version of the task, observers had to pick the circle that contained colors from the same family. And in the naming version of the task, observers picked the circle that contained a named color. We examined performance in a stroke patient that had language difficulties due to a left hemispheric lesion. While controls were much better in the naming task, the patient was better in the categorization version. This shows that categorization performance does not depend on naming. In a later study, we could also identify separate brain networks responsible for naming and categorization. So given the known dissociation between categorization and perception, these additional observations suggest that categorization can occur independently from both perception and naming. Second, I propose that categorization of color relies on generalization through learning that is not specific to color categorization. We investigated the relationship between color constancy and color term development. Color constancy is the ability to identify colors across illuminations. And we asked children to match colors across illuminations, as in the left image here. And we found that their color constancy was related to their color naming performance, but not to age or color discrimination performance. We confirmed that relationship in a study in which we measured color categorization across different illuminations. This led us to propose that both categorization and constancy rely on similar processes of generalization across stimulus variation based on learning and experience. Learning to generalize may also explain category-like responses in animals that do not have language, such as the birds in these two studies. It is important to note that categorization in non-human animals is always related to relevant objects or features in their environment rather than to color per se. This leads me to my final proposition, namely that color categories are related to relevant objects and materials in the environment. As eggs and beaks are relevant to those birds, human beings may have objects or object classes that are fundamental in their environment. For example, green, red, and blue may describe the color of plants, blood, and the sky and the sea. The regularities and differences of objects across cultures might at the same time explain the regularities and the differences of categorization across cultures. From a functional perspective, color perception primarily serves the purpose of identifying certain objects, materials, or features. And color terms allow for communicating about them with other people. Describing very specific color shades might be inadequate in an environment where objects and contexts vary. For this reason, it may be better to refer to categories that cover the range of potential variation. In this case, categories would be shaped so that they are optimal for communicating relevant objects and materials in our environment. To sum up, an ecological origin of color categorization starts with the needs and possibilities defined by the visual and the social and cultural environment. Ecological constraints may involve biological needs, such as the need to find water, and cultural artifacts, such as the availability of colored pigments. Features of our perceptual and cognitive system filter which information from the environment is available to us. For example, spectral information is lost due to the principle of univariance of human color perception. And similarly, social interaction defines which options are available to denote colors with communicative efficiency. General mechanisms of learning allow us to generalize the use of color names across many colors based on our everyday life experience. This generalization would then result in color categories. That's it. Thanks a lot for watching.